It's the end of a long day, so I'll try to keep it brief. But despite the fact that we have all thanked and been thanked, I'll also just add my note of appreciation, not just for his organization, but for the friendship that has grown through putting today's event together with Steve. And my note of appreciation to Yeshiva University for what I received here 25 plus years ago, and more so for what it's become in the years since. And it's nice to return home and to see the home on strong footing, and to all old friends who are responsible for making that happen, my thanks goes. Of course, it's the 50th anniversary of the Nobel, and how nice that to commemorate that, another nice little Jewish boy has been awarded the Nobel in Literature. Every year that email goes around about how could it be that Jews make up only 0.1% of world population, but yet 97% of all Nobel Prizes in every field have been awarded to Jews. And in October, we sit there as they make the announcements, and they say, this year's prize in chemistry goes to Professor Yokomura Makashui from the University of Tokyo, and we say, we've been robbed once again. And then if a name comes out and it's at all ambiguous, somebody goes quickly and Googles to see if we've added another trophy to our shelf. But
it's rigged.
It's rigged. The elections are rigged. But it is important. In all seriousness, it is important, and I presume there are some present who do remember it and experience the feelings that I'm describing. That when Agnon was awarded the Nobel in 1966, it was a major event in the Jewish world and in Israel. He was the first Israeli to win a Nobel in any field, and he was, and still is, the only Hebrew author awarded for literature. And in Israel, it was viewed as a major diplomatic coup. And the stories of what it meant in the country, Teddy Kollek having this Tfilat Haderech, hand written by a ritual scribe for him to take with him, what it meant for how people felt about Israel. Remember, 1966 is just a blip, a half a blip in time in the historical memory from the Holocaust. And the prize was correctly regarded as an award to the Jewish people, that not only had we physically survived the smokestacks of Auschwitz, but we had reconstituted ourselves as a sovereign nation. And the real mark of a sovereign nation is not only to put down your enemies in war, but is to develop a meaningful, rich culture. And literature, being the hallmark of that, was now being awarded. And the Hebrew language was being awarded. Agnon was not known as an overly modest person, as has been well documented. But he was known as possessing great mock modesty. And when he won the prize, there were a slew of interviews, some of which have been written up, some of which appear in the nonfiction volume Me'atzmi El Atzmi. And he says, Lichtov mishpat ivri kahogen shaveh kol haprasim sheba'olam. To be able to write a single sentence properly in Ivrit, in Hebrew, is worth all the prizes in the world. But he was happy to receive the prize as well. But he did very clearly express his, I believe, sincere thoughts that the Hebrew language, the newly reconstituted Hebrew language, I'm not sure, you mentioned a moment ago that he too deserves credit as a reviver of the Hebrew language. He would have not accepted that credit because he did not believe that Hebrew had been revived. Because in order for something to be revived, and this was part of the battle in the Hebrew wars between his camp, Bialik, and many others on one side against Ben Yehuda, in order for Hebrew to be revived, it first has to be dead. At most, Hebrew was in a coma and had to be awoken or given some smelling salts after having fainted for 2,000 years. but he saw the prize as a recognition of what Hebrew as a language of Jewish life and learning and literature and culture was and had reached. The stories and anecdotes in Maisalach of receiving the prize and going to Stockholm are fairly well known, what it meant for this. And he was quite old at the time. The average age of a Nobel laureate in literature is around the age of 60. People still have a good number of years. They have one more good novel left in them, usually when they receive the prize, or maybe one or two more albums, we have to say now. But Agnon was nearing 80. He was towards the end of his life, and although he was fiddling with Shira and fiddling with the stories, as Alan described this morning, that would become Irum Loa and a few other unfinished pieces of business, his career was already at an end, and he was this rather doughy older man who enjoyed a good stiff drink, looking rather ridiculous, looking rather penguin-like in his frock, in his white tie and tails. Here he is with his wife in Stockholm. Here he is with the King of Sweden. They call your name, you get the prize, you walk around, you shake hands with the king, and you're meant to walk on. And he starts, we don't have the transcript of what he said, but on the video, you can see, on the silent video, you can see him chewing off the ear of King Gustav, right? And Gustav apparently was a very tall man. Agnon was a very short man, so he's leaning over to here. He's a little hard of hearing, and Agnon is going on and on. Presumably they were talking in German, they're a common language, and Agnon is going on and on and on. He, of course, had famously made the bracha upon seeing Melech Basar Vedam. There they are. And when he gets the prize, when in the prize presentation, Ingvar Andersson of the Swedish Academy said the following: Shmuel Yosef Agnon and Nelly Sachs. Of course, again, I'll just say, we don't have time to go into it. He shared the prize with Nelly Sachs, no relation, who was a German Jewish poetess who had been living in Sweden, writing poetry in Holocaust poetry in German, and they shared the prize. And the politics of why this was the co-selection, hopefully we'll know a little more about it after in January, because the Swedish Academy keeps the file on each prize sealed for 50 years, and it'll be opening, and presumably Don Leor has already reserved his plane ticket to Sweden to be the first to look at those archives. But we know from a year ago, when the 1965 prize was opened, they were the runners-up in 1965. And the idea of pairing the two of them together was already a suggestion the year earlier. These two Jewish authors. Nelly Sachs was not well known before. She's still not well known. Agnon had never heard of her when he receives the prize and was not really very thrilled about the idea of sharing the prize. There is precedent for the prize being divided, but it's not so common. In fact, it was the last time it was done. The Constitution of the Nobel Committee states that a shared prize does not indicate that the recipient is only half worthy. Somebody that shares the prize, and this is true in the sciences as well, has to be worthy of having received it on their own. But sometimes people are working in, this happens more in the sciences, where people are working on similar research in chemistry or in physics. So it's reasonable, since one is working off the other, it's reasonable to share the prize. In literature, it happens less frequently. But Anderson introduces Agnon, and he says, this year's literary prize goes to you both with equal honor for your literary production, which records Israel's, meaning the Jewish people's, vicissitudes in our time and passes on its message to the peoples of the world. And then he turns to Agnon. In your writing, we meet once again the ancient unity between literature and science, as antiquity knew it. In one of your stories, you say that some will no doubt read it as they read fairy tales. Others will read it for edification. Anybody know what that quote is from? Which story does he say that? It's Bilvav Yamim. Your great chronicle of the Jewish people's spirit and life has therefore a manifold message. For the historian, it is a precious source. For the philosopher, an inspiration. For those who cannot live without literature, it is a mine of never-failing riches. We honor in you a combination of tradition and prophecy, there's a pregnant word, of saga and wisdom. And then he goes on to say, we honor you both this evening as the laurel-crowned heroes of intellectual creation and express our conviction that, in the words of Alfred Nobel, you've conferred the greatest benefit on mankind, and that you have given it clear-sightedness, wisdom, uplift, and beauty. A famous speech at a Nobel banquet, that of William Faulkner, held in this same hall 16 years ago, contained an idea which he developed with great intensity. It is suitable as a concluding quotation which points to the future. I do not, said Faulkner, I do not believe in the end of man. Now, I'm not sure that Mr. Svensson really had fully understood this connection, but there really is great resonance here. William Faulkner, the great American Southern writer, creates this wholly realized but literary world, Yakna, Pakanta County in Mississippi, whatever it's called, which really is like a Southern Buchach or Shibush, in the same way that Agnon creates this world, in the same way that Agnon, like Mark Twain, you can take the boy out of Buchach, but you can't take the Buchach out of the boy. He leaves Buchach, he's 19 years old, and he virtually never returns except for that 1 week visit, and again when his father passes away. But he never leaves it until he's 82 and he dies. He's still there in Buchach. It's part of him. Hannibal is part of Twain. Weequahic section of Newark is there in Roth. This fully realized sense of this world and its values and going back to it. But Faulkner's idea, in other words, Faulkner says this in 1950. 1950 is the dust is still settling over Auschwitz. I do not believe in the end of man. The power of literature as a vivifying force, as a reconstituting force, that somehow culture can be nearly destroyed, and yet in the spring, nitzanim niru ba'aretz, the sprouts will come up again. And that's what was being seen in the 1950s and 1960s, and nowhere less than in Medinat Yisrael, and in no delivery system less significant than the ancient Hebrew language, which was now returning. Agnon gets up and gives a speech. He gives the speech in Hebrew. It was inconceivable that he would do anything else, partially because he was incapable of delivering in any other language besides Yiddish, which would have been equally as non-understandable, or German, which was completely inconceivable that the Israeli Hebrew laureate would get up in 1966 and deliver an acceptance prize in German. Those were the only languages he could speak. He did not speak English. He really could not read English. Really, it was just Hebrew and Yiddish, of course, and German was the only foreign language. His mastery of all of world literature, which makes its way into, we talk about his absorption of Hebrew sources, of course. Hachnasat Kala is in certain aspect modeled on Don Quixote, which he would have read in Bialik's Hebrew translation. Don Quixote had been translated a number of times. Before Bialik, it had been translated to Yiddish as well. He read Proust and Balzac in translation to German because he couldn't read French. But the influence of Proust, if you've read Simple Story, the influence of Proust should be obvious. But he reads it in German. So for those that read, part of how I calm my anxiety at night as being involved in the translation of Agnon into English is that sometimes it's okay to read things in translation. Abba Iban, who was foreign minister, thought that he should have a hand in crafting Agnon's speech because, after all, in terms of Hasbara, in terms of defending Israel, what could be a better platform than a Nobel Prize? Agnon, at least according to the anecdote, said, tell Abba Iban when he gets the Nobel, he can write his own prize. But he was going to deliver it. So what happened? How could he deliver it in Hebrew? There wasn't a soul in the room who could understand Hebrew. So he delivered the opening section in Ivrit, and then the whole thing was read on his behalf by Mr. Anderson in English. So what you have on this sheet is an abridged, you see there's an ellipsis towards the end. This is an abridged version, a highly abridged version of the speech. And you see about 3/4 of the way down in parentheses, it says, out of respect for time, the rest of my words will be read in translation only. So from the Reisha until those parentheses, he read in Hebrew, and then the whole thing, beginning to end, was read on his behalf in English. But as a piece of rhetoric, it's a rather bizarre talk, because the whole thing is about, in English, it's a little over 2,000 words. A full 50% of it is him telling his biography. He reminds them that after all, in the Gemara, it says that the Anshe Yerushalayim would not sit to dine with people unless they knew who they were, and therefore it's not appropriate, since here we're all makpid on the words of the Gemara. And I'm thinking, like, the king of Sweden is looking at this old Jewish man with the big black yarmulke talking about the Talmud, right? He's thinking, what is this rabbi yammering on about? So he says, I must tell you something about myself. And he spends a full half of the speech giving a biography. But anybody that knows anything about Agnon knows that his biography was part of his greatest literary, artistic, fictional creations. Everything about him, from his date of birth to his date of aliyah to his very name, were part of the myth, part of the fable of who Agnon was. We know that he was born in 1887. In the summer of 1887. He said, of course, he was born on Tisha B'Av 1888, which fell out on August 8th that year, 8/8/88. You can quickly Google and see that Tisha B'Av that year did not fall out on August 8th. Neither did it fall out Tisha B'Av on his birthday the year before. He was born around Tisha B'Av in 1887. He fibbed the year of his birth, partially because that had to do with dodging the draft. But the symbolism of having been born on Tisha B'Av for a writer who's possessed by the idea of the relationship of Galut v'Geula is, we can understand why somebody would choose to make up a story about himself in that way. He chooses a pen name from Agunot, right? He literally anchors his name in those notions, but not the agunot of husband and wife, the way we colloquially use the term, but the igun of the Jewish people being chained to our Father in heaven and being distanced from him. Because if we go with the midrashic idea of God and the Jewish people being like husband and wife, this is a marriage which could use a little counseling. God has not divorced us, but maybe we're separated these many years since we left Jerusalem. We are agunot. God has abandoned us. We are the abandoned wife. And these are themes that echo again and again and again throughout his writing. So this biography that he gives, which to the uninitiated may have seemed odd, it may have seemed odd as a rhetorical. If you compare his speech to other Nobel laureate speeches, it's a very different style. But if we think about it carefully, because it's not biography as biography, it's biography as midrash, with a lowercase m, if you will. It's part of the myth of himself, but it really becomes part of the myth, or the legend, I should say, of the Jewish people that he's trying to communicate to King Gustav and the rest of the crowd in Stockholm. Of course, the famous quote, literally the money quote that until last year was on the 50 shekel note, until we changed the money in Israel. Here it is. This is the part where Rabbi Glickman will cry, and Avram will be pleased to hear the Glitziana Hebrew.
שהחליף טיטוס מלך רומי את ירושלים וגלה ישראל מארצו, נולדתי אני באחת מערי הגולה, אבל בכל עת תמיד דומה הייתי עליי כמי שנולד בירושלים.
Out of the historic catastrophe, mitoch catastrophe historic, Shechriv Titus Melech Romi at Yerushalayim. How'd I do? It's all right. Because of the historic catastrophe that Titus comes and destroys Jerusalem and kicks out the Jews, I was born in one of the cities of the diaspora. But I always imagined myself as one who was born Nolad b'Yerushalayim. And then he goes on to say, in a dream, in a vision of the night, I saw myself standing with my brother Levites. Agnon was a Levi, as he always liked to remind people, in the holy temple, singing with them the songs of David Melech Yisrael, melodies such as no ear has heard since the day our city was destroyed and its people went into exile. I suspect that the angels in charge of the shrine of music, fearful lest I sing in wakefulness what I had sung in dream, made me forget by day what I had sung at night. For if my brethren, the sons of my people, were to hear, they would be unable to bear their grief over the happiness they've lost. To console me for having prevented me from singing with my mouth, they enable me to compose songs in writing. Now this, like so many other autobiographical claims, on one level is highly outlandish. But what's significant is the story he chooses to tell about how he thought his work unfolded. He's being compensated. Really, by all rights, he should every day get up and go to the Beit HaMikdash and sing the Shirei David Melech Yisrael. That's the job of a Levi. But that's been taken away. And instead, writing his stories, those 24, there's symbolism of somebody who composes 24 books. Those 24 big fat volumes of modern Hebrew literature are a compensation, a pitzui, for avodat Beit HaMikdash having been taken away from him. He's being compensated to compose in prose what was formerly sung in praise. It's a radical statement. He's equating his work as a modern author with nothing less than avodat Hashem. In what way is it avodat Hashem? In this rather grandiloquent manner that he's trying to communicate. So he goes on to say, how did he come to write in this manner? And he tells a story that he had told in a variety of different formats that appears both in the works of fiction as well as in these variety of talks he gave on different occasions, when he won the Israel Prize, when he got an honorary doctorate at Bar Ilan in 1956. On other occasions, at some event at Shokin's house. You have some quotes on the back side of the page. And here you really do see a point that Shalom Karmi mentioned this morning about the purity of religious experience when it's depicted through the eyes of the child in the stories, as opposed to adults where things get a little more messy. Whenever we see the child in his grandfather's house, the child with the chumash, the child with his sidur, the child receiving his first pair of tefillin, the young boy going off with his father and grandfather, his first memories of going to shul on Yom Kippur, and the grandeur and the splendor of Yom Kippur. So there you really do get it in all of its mystery, in all of its grandeur. So he tells the following story in a variety of ways. He says, I was 5 years old when I wrote my first song. It was out of longing for my father that I wrote it. It happened that my father, of blessed memory, went away on business, and I was overcome with longing for him, and I made a song. In the longer passage from the Bar Ilan speech, he gives richer detail of what his inner life was like. And here's the song. His father, remember, Agnon had learned in Cheder. And he had this very close relationship with this father. His father was a Talmid Chacham, he was a Rav. Apparently he wrote a sefer on the Mishnah Torah, which was one of the things destroyed in the house fire in 1924. Agnon had a very happy, stable childhood. He was the eldest of 5 children. The sun and the moon and the stars in between all revolved around him. He was recognized as an Ilui for his talents, for everything. And the father, who worked in the fur trade, would have to go away a few times a year to the regional fairs to do whatever you did at those regional fairs. And he's so longing and sick for the absence of his father. He comes home in the Bar Ilan speech. In the Bar Ilan speech, it's a little better because as he comes home. Keshehig vati roshi mi kapot hamanul, no less. He's standing there al kapot hamanul, which is a resonance we should remember of longing, of desire, not fulfilled. And he knows that on the other side of the door, he'll go home and Abba won't be there, Tate won't be there. And I'm so missing him. So what happens? Nitakra anachami libi v'karati. This wail goes up from my heart on its own. And I cry out, Eifo ata Abba, Abba. Where are you? Father, Father, where can you be found? V'toch kedei amira, nizdavga kriya shniya. And right away, another cry comes forth. Again, he's describing it. It's happening on its own. He's not sitting at the laborious task of composing a poem. These words are just flowing out of him. What does that sound like? Shira or Nevuah. Tefillah, we have to generate the words. Nevuah, the words come to us on their own. He's not making the claim that he's a Navi, but he's understanding that his readers would maybe hear an echo of something here. Eifo ata Abba, Abba, ohafti otcha ahava rabba. Father, Father, where can you be found? And I who love you with a love so profound. It's not great poetry. He wouldn't get the Nobel for these first two lines. But it's a description of the artist as a young man, the initiation of the artist to his craft, that the art of writing, the art of composing, is one that comes through some kind of nearly divine inspiration, but is also the first and immediate reaction to pain and loss. That the art of writing, at least for Agnon, is a response to suffering, is a response to longing, is about standing al kapot hamanul, at the handles of the lock, and not knowing if your desires will be met. And you don't need to be a great literary scholar to understand that in all of his stories, particularly the stories of childhood, if you read the story Hamit Pachat, the kerchief, right, which also features this element of the father going away to the Yarid and the mother sitting by the window, waiting in anticipation for him to return. Because it's not like today. I'm going to leave here. I'm going to go back to Israel, right? I'm going to be on the phone with my wife from the plane. I'm going to get in the car. She's going to be able to see on Waze exactly when I'm going to be parking. My kids will be waiting in the front of the house. Not because they missed me. They want to see what's in the suitcase. But in those days, Abba went off to the Yarid. You didn't know when he was going to come back. Maybe today, maybe tomorrow, maybe, God forbid, something happens, he won't make it. You don't need to have great knowledge in unpacking literary symbols to understand that the longing for the missing father can be midrashically interpreted as the longing for Avinu Sheba Shamayim. And he's able, the multivalences of the story, just like all midrashic writing, to say it means this, and it means that. So that when he stands there in Stockholm and makes this statement about mitoch catastrophe historic, out of the historic catastrophe that Jerusalem was taken and we were sent into the exile, and I always imagined myself, what is he saying? So I believe that very subtly, not in an intertextual way, he's not quoting psukim that would have drawn our attention to this, but in a kind of thematic intertextuality, thematic interconnection, I believe he's drawing our attention to a different time that a Jew talked about singing a song. Tehillim Kuf Lamed Zayin, Al Naharot Bavel. We know the Mizmor. We don't need to go through it carefully together. But Ruth Weiss, who was with us this morning and unfortunately wasn't able to stay for the rest of the day, points out in her really important book, Jews in Power, that Judaism's ambiguous relation to power goes back to its earliest recorded history, to Psalm 137, which conveys the predicament of the captives in Babylon following the sack of Jerusalem. Their captors taunt the Jews by ordering them to perform songs of Zion. Sha'alu divrei shir, shiru lanu mishir Tzion. Ha ha ha! You Jews, you captive Jews with your harps, give us a song. One of them old ditties you used to sing in that burned temple of yours. The Jews refuse, uttering instead the pledge that will resound through the ages. If I forget you, O Jerusalem, tishkach yemini. What do they sing? They sing about their longing for Jerusalem. When the Jews finally do sing out in that psalm, their tune is very different from the dirges that their captors demanded. Remember, O Lord, against the Edomites the day of Jerusalem's fall, how they cried, strip her to the very foundations. Fair Babylon, you predator, a blessing on him who repays you in kind what you inflicted on us. You want a song? We'll sing you a song. We'll sing you a song about what happens to the people that oppress the Jews. So the Edomites, the generic enemies of Israel, Babylon, the immediate aggressor, rather than crushing the Jews' morale, the scorn of their captors has spiked Jewish anger and stiffened national resolve. For all its rhetorical severity, Psalm 137 does not exhort Jews to take up arms on their own behalf, which was, inconceivable. Assuming full moral responsibility for the violence that war requires, it calls on the Lord to avenge the Jews' defeat and on other nations to repay Babylon in kind. This reflects the historical record. It was the Persians, not the Jews, who defeated the Babylonians, and King Cyrus who allowed the Jews to return to Jerusalem to rebuild the temple, thereby inspiring Isaiah's reference to him as the Lord's anointed, the messenger of God's will, God's hand, not the soldiering of Israel, is credited with the Jews' political recovery. So here's Agnon. It's 1966. He's standing in Europe, Stockholm, not Berlin, but Bechol. And he's being awarded this prize. The Swedish Academy has finally recognized the Jewish people, the Hebrew language, the nation, the state of Israel. And he's asked to give a speech. Shiru lanu mishir Tzion, not with the same evil that the Bavlim did. But Bechol Zot, he's standing there in the shadow of the days after the Holocaust. He says, you want me to sing you a song? I'll sing you a song. Let me tell you. What do? We do not respond. We do not wage war. And if we have waged war in 1948 and, unbeknownst to him, 6 months later in 1967, on the day that he happened to be here at YU, receiving an honorary doctorate. So he says, so we do what we have to do. But what's our response to pain? What's our response? What's the authentic Jewish response to suffering? Right? We know what it means to live in exile. Weiss goes on, the first Babylon exile proved that the Jewish nation could survive outside the land of Israel, leaving open the question of when and how they would regain it. Heine's homeland in the text. We knew how to survive. And now we've returned. Do you know how we still survive? In the text. But our texts become transformed, and we begin cultural production again in our own language in an authentic way. The kind of writing for which Rav Kook, years earlier, had already recognized Agnon's significance, that he was writing a Sefer Ivri Be'emet Hanovea Min HaTzinorot Lolo Shum Mechitza, whatever that means, but it sounds great as a book. Like if they had blurbs on book jackets back then, he would have put that. Maybe we should do that in one of the English editions, right? Rav Kook says this is flowing through the divine channels with no barrier. Five stars. That's the authentic Jewish response to pain and catastrophe. Mitoch catastrophe historit, we're going to write modern literature. And I think, if I'm not over-reading it, and perhaps I am, this is the subtext of what he said standing there 50 years ago in Stockholm.